This is Richard Salvador and Annette Unten. The three of us are now coordinate this event, a monthly event that we're so pleased to have you here with us. And it always starts with a little potluck, food sharing and fellowship, and then we have a speaker. And the point of the Pacific Peace Forum is a training ground in utilizing nonviolence, a community-based training so that everybody understands what nonviolence, non-killing is, and looking for different methods of making the world a better place. And so tonight is Leon Siu, and he will be talking to us about the latest findings and things that he can report from his return from Geneva. But before we do that, next month, July 3rd, we have Elizabeth Sahtouris, if you can stand. She's an evolutionary biologist and futurist, a world-renowned speaker on a major circuit that will be coming to speak with us. And this so happens because she has moved to Hawaii. So we're very glad. So please come back next month. Okay, now without further ado, I would like to introduce my dear friend Leon Siu. Thank you.
Aloha. Aloha. Aloha I mai o kou, ai maruhia hoi ke akua, e ko ka mapua e ka haku Yesu, me ka uhane i mole. Greetings. So such a pleasure to see everybody here tonight. I was on Kauai last night doing a similar presentation, and we had a really good turnout there too. It's always good to be back home. I've been spending a lot of time on the road. It's a pretty intense kind of a lifestyle because you're there on a mission to try to get things accomplished, and you have to be prepared for a lot of different things, as well as just be able to meet these different challenges. Most recently, I was in Geneva at the UPR, which is the Universal Periodic Review of the United Nations. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history going back a few years. The Hawaiian Kingdom, or let's say the Hawaiian people, have had representation at the United Nations for over 40 years. It actually started with a guy named Kawai Puna Regime. And Kawai Puna got this whole thing, this notion that we should go speak to the United Nations. And so he went. And he happened to show up at the same time that other indigenous peoples and other captured nations were seeking to get the attention of the United Nations. So the AIM people, American Indian movement, was there also because they had just occupied Alcatraz, and there was the whole incident at Wounded Knee. Yeah, thank you. And so they were now in the international arena seeking some kind of audience or some kind of venue where they could bring their issues. So it was the Hawaiians, the American Indian movement, and a whole bunch of others from South America, from Asia, from all over the world. All of a sudden, indigenous peoples and captured nations started showing up at the United Nations, particularly at the Human Rights Committee. And well, what they were doing is trying to say, we have issues of having been colonized or having been suppressed by another nation, and we would really like to have some way to address these issues, because the founding of the United Nations is to bring about peaceful resolution of conflicts and disputes among nations. And so these people were saying, we're nations. We're maybe Indian nations or this type of nation, that island nations, but we need to be able to address the United Nations because we still have some issues that need to be resolved. So that movement started out, the Kawai Puna regime was right there at the very beginning, contributed tremendously to the advancement of the issues around forgotten peoples, captured nations. And then after him, Oh, he continued for a while, but then other people started going as well. Poka Lainui, who many of us know, was in the 80s. He was very active in this effort to bring attention to our plight in Hawaii as well as to the other nations. So he was instrumental in the drafting of many different documents that were put out during what is called a working group on indigenous peoples. After him, or around the same time, but succeeding him in many ways, was Mililani Trask. And Bampikanahele was also very active during that time, in the early 90s. And so we've always had some kind of representation. The United Nations is a very interesting organization or organism. And what it is, it's a country club. You know? It's a club of countries. You got to belong to this club in order to have any kind of say about things. Now, of course, there are many what they call civil society groups, and Amnesty International, and various kinds of human rights groups that all go and bring their issues before the United Nations. But they don't have the clout or the stature as another country has. So these other countries in this country club, they number 193 member countries in the United Nations today. It started out with 51 in 1945, and so it's built up to 193. In other words, back in 1945, there were only 51 countries that recognized each other as having some kind of sovereign status, and the others were all considered colonies or nations or occupied territories that needed to be decolonized, and that was the term that was used. And the decolonization meant that these countries, all that were not the 51 countries, the others, all had the right, the peoples and the nations had the right to access self-determination. In other words, they had the right to determine their future, whether they wanted to become integrated within an administrative nation, or whether they wanted to be to have a free association relationship, or whether they wanted to be independent. So these three choices eventually became the three choices that made up the process for decolonization. And all decolonization means is that the people need to be helped to get to the point where they can have a healthy discussion and an open discussion, and then make a decision amongst themselves what they want to do with the future governance. So the decolonization thing wasn't so that it would free all the nations. It basically said, we're going to give nations the opportunity to free themselves, or to become free. And it was the administrative nations, like the United States in our case, and like Great Britain and France and the other colonizing nations. They were now called administrative nations. They were still administrating these territories that were called non-self-governing territories. So those administrative nations, it became their responsibility under the UN Charter to assist these countries to get to the point where they can express their self-determination. Okay, so that's what happened. So after 1946, nations began to get to the point where they could express their self-determination, and many of them chose to become independent. So that by today, we now have 193 from the original 51 nations. So nearly 3/4 of the United Nations consist of nations that were once captured or colonized or some otherwise occupied by another nation. So this is the setting today. In other words, for those remaining territories like Hawaii, and I'll explain a little bit more about why we're a remaining territory. But for these other territories that are still not free, there's 3/4 of the members of the club actually understand our situation because they were there at one time. And so we have the ability, or at least the sympathy and empathy of these nations to support our movement toward making that decision, whether we want to be independent or become an integrated state, or free association. So we all understand Hawaii's situation. What happened, of course, was the illegal seizure of our country in 1893, and then the illegal imposition of another government called the Republic of Hawaii, and then the illegal attempted annexation, and then the actual illegal transfer of authority from the Republic of Hawaii to the United States, which they called the annexation. So we all know that part of the story. All of those activities back then, all of those events that happened back then, actually don't come under the purview of the United Nations. Because the United Nations didn't actually get started until 1945. So it's difficult to go to the United Nations and talk to them about all these illegal actions that happened in the past and have them try to correct those. So what we have to do is look for something that the United Nations was actually in operation and actually participated in a wrongdoing to our nation. And that was 1959. In 1946, and right after the United Nations was formed, those 51 countries that were the original members all fessed up. And they said, okay, we still have some of these other countries under our rule. And so they all submitted other countries onto the list of what is called the non-self-governing territories. So Great Britain put all its colonies into that list. France put its colonies into that list. The United States put its territories into that list. And those territories included the 4 territories that were, 3 territories that were assumed under the after the Spanish-American War. That's Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, 4, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, those 4. And they also included Hawaii and Alaska in 1946 to the list of non-self-governing territories, which was a bit of a surprise, and we weren't really sure what their motives were, but we can kind of guess at it now. Now we see how things have transformed and have come into being. But what happened was in 1946, Alaska and Hawaii were put onto that list of non-self-governing territories, which meant that the United States had an obligation under international law to assist us to make a choice, whether we want to become integrated, whether we want to have free association, independence and free association, and then or complete independence. So the United States did something very tricky. In 1959, they conspired and pulled off what looked to be an actual plebiscite or a referendum, in which they said the Hawaiians and the Alaskans both chose in their referendum to become part of the United States, integrated totally into the United States as states of the United States. And they did have a plebiscite here in Hawaii. They had a plebiscite in Alaska. But those 2 plebiscites were highly rigged to come out with only one outcome. And that was that there would be a yes vote for integration to become a state of the United States. Later, as the decolonization process proceeded, it became more apparent that the U.S. had rushed forward to get us integrated into the United States before the United Nations was able to set down actual rules on how the administrating nation was supposed to treat its territories. In other words, in this process of plebiscites. So the rules for plebiscites since 1960 are really clear. And what the United States did, as we looked in retrospect, if those rules today were in place then, hard rules, then the plebiscite would be automatically ruled illegal or as inadequate to have provided an actual decision on the part of the people, an actual consent. But the United States snuck it in before there were actual hard rules. Still, it was a devious way to do this because really our people did not participate. And there's a lot of discussion that has gone on over this. And basically the problem is, as Polka language likes to say, who is the self in self-determination? In other words, they asked the wrong people to make the decision. They didn't ask the people of our nation. They asked the occupiers who were here the question, and they all voted. The U.S. citizens voted in that election to become a U.S. state. That happened in Alaska as well. So what we have been doing at the United Nations is trying to find a way that we can get the United Nations itself. Well, okay, what happened in 1959 is the United States had this fake plebiscite, and then they reported to the United Nations that Hawaii had chosen to become part of the United States. The United Nations then removed us from the list, saying that the obligation of the administrative nation, the United States, was now completed, that we had made a conscious decision. Only they never had an actual review, or they never oversaw the actual process that happened in Hawaii. So they rubber stamped a false report. And that false report, we can now go back and look at. And if we can show or cause a review to happen today, and it will show that there were improper means of how they conducted the plebiscite. And it would then negate the United Nations rubber stamp of Hawaii and be considered a state of the United States, and it would also erase the claim by the United States that we have fully exercised our right to self-determination. So what we had to do is to find a way that we can get the United Nations to acknowledge that there was a mistake made by the United Nations, and for whatever reason they made a mistake in rushing and approving and taking the Hawaiian Islands off the list of non-self-governing territories. So, as I explained to you earlier, the United Nations is a club of nations, or a country club, and that country club comprises of 193 nations, each one there to watch out for their own interests. So, in other words, these representatives, ambassadors, and diplomats have been sent to the United Nations to make sure that whatever decisions go on, that they protect themselves from any kind of harm, and two, that if they participate in any kind of forward movement, that it still is beneficial for their own people. So the real big incentive at the United Nations is to help your country, help represent the best interest of your own country. And that's how it functions there. So if you watch the United Nations, it doesn't function on the basis of what's right or what's wrong, what's good or what's bad, or any kind of linear and obvious kinds of ways that other people make decisions. It really functions on the basis of how will it affect us? How will it affect my country? How will it affect other countries? So it makes it really difficult for countries like ours that don't have a voice or a place in the United Nations to really bring our issue forward. We can put a lot of petitions in, we can file a lot of complaints and what they call reviews and petitions, shadow reports, all kinds of things we can put in there to bring to their attention. But those don't really have an effect unless a country in that club brings it forward and says, we're interested in following this through. And that's been the hard part for Hawaii. It's finding a country that would, there's lots that sympathize with us and empathize with us because they've been there, but they're not really eager to take on the United States. So nobody is going to do anything that will be a full frontal attack against the United States. They're not going to say, we're going to recognize the Hawaiian Kingdom, or we're going to reestablish the treaty we had with the Hawaiian Kingdom back in the 1900s. You're not going to say that because that's going to somehow adversely affect them. And they're right about that. The United States is a really big bully. But that bully acts in many, many levels. Most of it not obvious. Most of it is very, very sneaky and undermining types of things that they can do. And these countries are very much aware of it. So nobody wants to speak up directly against the United States. So it left us with two problems. One, we don't have a voice there. Two, even if we try to find a country, most countries we couldn't find a country that would actually directly confront the United States about our situation. So over the years, what we have been doing is continually filing our petitions and our complaints so that we could educate the nations really about the law that pertains to us, the international law, and that we are talking to them and that we have been wronged and we need to have their support. And so like I said, many nations do understand that and many sympathize with us. But we had to also find a way that they could act that would be in the most minimum kind of reaction or kickback or backlash to themselves. So it was a really tricky thing. So over the years, we've been talking and getting advice from different advisors within the United Nations who were saying, well, try this, try that, try going through this committee, and maybe that committee will help to advance you to the next committee and all that. It's been kind of a long process, but it's been forward moving all the time. And what occurred a couple of years ago was that French Polynesia in May of 2013 was re-inscribed on the list of non-self-governing territories. And what happened in the 1980s, the French had taken French Polynesia off the list by just ignoring filing any more reports, annual reports on how French Polynesia is progressing toward self-determination. So when they stopped doing those reports, all of a sudden French Polynesia dropped off the list. But 30 years later, it was suddenly back on the list. Well, that wasn't an accident. A lot of island nations campaigned for a long time, and they got French Polynesia re-inscribed. 27 years earlier, they had gotten New Caledonia re-inscribed. So the French were really now under fire, but the whole process of decolonization was starting now to become more, people became more aware of it. And I'm talking about the nations within this country club. They became more aware that there still are nations out there that need to be decolonized. So French Polynesia's re-inscription on the list of non-self-governing territories meant that now the committee was going to be given more work for the job that they're supposed to be doing. And it also meant that the other countries became more aware of the fact that the decolonization process had slowed down to a crawl for almost 30 years. It didn't do anything. And so based on French Polynesia's reinscription and the effort that it took to get them reinscribed, we had momentum now going to wake up the decolonization process in the United Nations. So immediately there is a gentleman who is called the Independent Expert for the Promotion of a Democratic and Equitable International Order. So the Independent Expert for the Promotion of a Democratic and Equitable International Order. That's his title. Kind of and the UN has titles for all these strange kind of things. But actually, this person is given the job of looking at the United Nations and all its mechanisms and giving his opinion and recommendations of how these could be improved. And as we know, the United Nations has a lot of room for improvement. And so he took a look at the decolonization process. Now this person had also been very much aware of our struggle over the last 30 years because he's actually watched our struggle. And so he put in a recommendation in after the reinscription of French Polynesia, he put a recommendation into the General Assembly in his report saying that the Decolonization Committee should take a look at, actually should receive communications from, which is meaning take a look at these cases that are still out there. And he named Alaska, Hawaii, the Dakotas, the Mapuche, the Kashmiri, the Rapa Nui, West Papua, Maluku, Aceh, and all of these other nations that are out there that are not on the list, but are still obviously being occupied by somebody else. And so he put this recommendation in, and that really stirred some things up, in that we are working now to get some nations to back that recommendation to actually make it into a resolution that would reawaken the decolonization process in the United Nations. But by putting in that recommendation, he actually used a language that was non-threatening. It didn't say that the United States ought to give up Hawaii. It didn't say that Indonesia had to give up West Papua. All it said that these countries have the right to have their cases looked at. So this year, in May of 2011, the United States is going through something called the Universal Periodic Review of the United States. The Universal Periodic Review is a periodic review of a country's human rights record, yes. The violations and or the good things that they're doing on the human rights. So the country, it's a cycle. Every country in the United Nations goes through this review. So the United States term came up this year. 6 months before, they have to put in their report, official report from the United States, saying what they're doing in the area of human rights. In other words, they kind of rate themselves and try to emphasize the good things that they're doing, and try to say we're going to improve in this area. And that particular review comes out 6 months ahead of time, so that the other countries have an opportunity to review that particular report and then make some comments or recommendations on that report. So on May 11th of this year, the United States presented a verbal presentation of their report to the United Nations on the Universal Periodic Review of the United States. And then right after the verbal presentation by the United States, the other states all get to then make what they call an intervention. That is, they make their comments. There were so many countries that signed up to respond to the United States. There were 123 countries that signed up. It's like 10 times more than any other review that goes on. And all these countries were waiting to say something to the United States about their human rights records. Now, the reason is because, of course, the United States is accusing everybody else of human rights violations. And much of it is true, but everybody else is now waiting to pounce on the United States and say, okay, you criticize us, well, what about this or that? So there were so many who signed up that they were very limited to an amount of time that they could use. They had 1 minute and 5 seconds, each country, to say something. So they had to be real choosy and pick exactly what they wanted to say in the most concise way. I mean, they were reading really fast through their interventions, but they had to pick the ones that they wanted to do. Pakistan picked 7 items that they wanted to respond to, and they did that. And the last item, they had enough time to get in, had to do with us. And so, in order, again, for a country to spend that short amount of time that they have on one item having to do with Hawaii and Alaska and the Dakotas, whether they included that, is a real investment of their opportunity to speak to the United States. So just having them say something meant that they wanted to say something about Hawaii. So what they did was they couched their question to the United States. Basically said, how do you respond to this recommendation that was made by the independent expert a year and a half ago about including Hawaii and Alaska and the Dakotas to be able to address or to be able to access the decolonization process of the United Nations. So it was a very simple question, and it seemed to be kind of an innocuous question. It wasn't threatening or anything else, just asking the United States, how would you respond? But if you read the recommendation and if you understood the situation of Hawaii and Alaska, it was a very strong, the strongest way that they could say it without getting into trouble themselves. But it basically blew the issue up into bringing it into the issue under international law rather than under domestic law. As we know, the United States has been desperately trying for the last 15 years to reduce us into a domestic Indian tribe. And 15 years they've been doing that, just pounding away at it. And for 15 years we resisted it. And so the United States was trying to keep our issue, and it continues to try to keep our issue under a domestic solution to the problem of the occupation of Hawaii. But now Pakistan is saying we should consider this as an international issue, that it's a decolonization issue. That puts us under international law. And again, so I go back, this was significant, this was a huge breakthrough on our part. We had tried for years to get a country to mention us, and finally we had the language that they could use to protect themselves as well as to say what needed to be said on our behalf. If you understand this club, again, as I said earlier, nobody does anything that is contrary to their own interests or doesn't promote their interests. And so for Pakistan to have said this in a public, official, formal hearing and to spend 1/7 of the 1 minute that they had on our question was a significant thing, but they wouldn't have done that unless they had talked to all their other buddies in the club and said, how is this going to affect you? If we say this, are you going to get into trouble? What trouble do you think that we will have if we say this? So they vetted this for months as to whether they would say anything. And they said it, which meant that a lot of other nations gave them the go-ahead. Now, Pakistan is one of the key players in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is 57 member nations. And those member nations, that particular intergovernmental organization is second only in size to the United Nations itself. It's the largest intergovernmental agency.